Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. Every year on my birthday, since about fourth grade, when my birthday cake is brought out and I blow out my candles, I have thought, I wish for my mom to get better. And all of these years later, that is still what I wish for every single year. My mom has dealt with chronic pain for her entire life. And there were some years as I was growing up that she would be in bed with the lights out with a violent migraine for half the week, pretty much every week. According to the World Health Organization, migraines affect 20% of the world's women and 8% of men. Sometimes my mom's doctors have been compassionate but uninformed about her condition. And sometimes they've been arrogant and dismissive. Multiple times, she's been misdiagnosed for her pain. And after a fall in 2001, she received a misdiagnosis that led to permanent nerve damage in her back that has caused excruciating pain on top of her migraines. So in 2021, when I heard about a book called Unwell Women, Misdiagnosis and Myth in a Man-Made World, I knew I had to read it. I did read it and I discussed it with a friend of mine on season 1 of the podcast. And it has turned out to be one of my very favorite and most highly recommended books of all the books that I've read for Breaking Down Patriarchy. So today I am so honored to welcome to the podcast Dr. Elinor Cleghorn, the author of Unwell Women. Welcome, Elinor.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy. It's such a pleasure to be here.
It is such a pleasure to have you. And I was just saying to Elinor, and I'll repeat it here, I read a lot of books, especially in women's studies. And some of the books I read are very dense and academic, and I've learned a ton from them, and they're very, very useful. But I can't really easily recommend them to people because they're hard to get through. It's difficult language and jargony sometimes, or they require some kind of niche amount of knowledge in a particular field. And I so appreciate when I get a book that is well researched, really, really smart and scholarly, but really accessible and enjoyable to read. And this is one of those books. So thank you. Thank you for doing such high quality research, but also making it much more readable so that so many more people can benefit from it. I so appreciate this book.
Well, thank you so much. That's really the highest praise. And as we were talking about before we began recording, it was really, really important to me that this book was accessible to anybody with an interest in the topic, anybody who had a personal connection, as you do. And I'm so sorry for what your mother has been through. Anybody with a personal connection to illness, anybody who identified as an unwell woman, who knew or loved an unwell woman, or who themselves have been through difficult experience with negotiating their health needs within the medical establishment. So that accessibility was very, very important to me. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to hear that. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you. And listeners, I will say, I'll just repeat again, if you haven't bought this book and read it, really do buy it and read it. And this is such a good one to give. If I hear all the time, like, what's a book that I could give to my dad? What's a book that I could give to my husband that he would, be able to read and be interested in reading? This is one of them. So but let's start, as we always do, with kind of a biography, getting to know you a little bit better, Elinor. Maybe I'll just read your kind of official professional biography, and then we'll have you tell your story a little bit more personally after that. Dr. Elinor Cleghorn is a feminist cultural historian. After receiving her PhD in 2012, Elinor spent 3 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the Ruskin School at the University of Oxford, working on an interdisciplinary medical humanities project. She now works as a writer and researcher and lives in Sussex. She is the author of the book Unwell Women, Misdiagnosis and Myth in a Man-Made World. And again, we'll focus our conversation mostly on that book, but we'll also branch out from there. But now, if you could kind of introduce us to you a little bit more personally and tell us where you're from, some of the factors that made you who you are today, and what brought you to become a feminist cultural historian and then to write this book.
Sure. So I have a background in feminist cultural history. I did my PhD in historical and cultural studies at the University of London, and my focus was really on women's kind of contributions to early cinema. And it was a very sort of specific field, but my background is in art history. After I did my PhD, I pursued an academic career for a few years, but it was exceptionally difficult because the university in the UK, the university as a system in the UK, is really in a lot of crisis. And it was very, very hard to kind of get my sort of foot into an academic career. And then I was lucky enough to get this position at the Ruskin School of Art at the University of Oxford, which was this interdisciplinary project looking at a neurological condition called mirror touch synesthesia and its relevances and resonances with art, with film, with other forms of media. So that experience really enabled me to sort of pivot a bit from this kind of straight art history, feminist art history, into the discipline that we call the medical humanities. So my interest in medicine, but more specifically in the lived experience of people with illness, really sort of germinated during that experience. But that was the kind of professional roots of how I got to write the book. There's also a really personal story in that I am myself an unwell woman. I have a autoimmune disease called lupus that was diagnosed after my second son was born. I had a really difficult pregnancy. My son had a very slow heart rate while in utero. And this is a rare condition that, and one of the only causes are the antibodies, part of the immune system that causes this disease called lupus. So my diagnosis came as a shock, but it also came as a vindication because for years I'd experienced chronic pain and many other symptoms, both physiological and mental. And every time I'd gone to the doctors to try and get some answers about what was happening in my body, I was not only dismissed, but dismissed with some sort of excuse that my pain and other symptoms were the fault of my femaleness. So I either got told that I was anxious, I was worrying too much about my body, that I was paying too much attention to myself. One doctor accused me of being pregnant, not accused me, but said I must be pregnant and not realize. And after a while, I just thought, okay, I am making this up. This is in my head. So the diagnosis was a real vindication for this. Being a historian, my impulse was to look backwards to understand what was happening in the present. And that involved a combination of looking back into my own history of my body, my illness, my encounters with doctors and other health professionals, but also looking back into medicine's history to find women like me who'd been through experiences like this. And some of the first case studies I found of young women with lupus from the 19th century, although very different worlds away in terms of the language and sort of clinical explanations, when it came to the dismissal, the misdiagnosis, the overlooking of women's pain, it was so very present. And it occurred to me, why has medical science advanced exponentially over a century, yet these basic attitudes towards women's pain and towards the validity and legitimacy of women's pain are still with us? And that was really what inspired me to expand this little bit of kind of very personally imposed investigation into the research that became the book Unwell Women.
I feel like those are often the most powerful works of scholarship are when someone like you is, academically trained and then also has kind of an engine driving them in a particular area that is personal and it's based in lived experience, and that both of those things I think combine and come through really strongly in the book. So thank you so much for sharing that. And just thank you for sharing those incredibly frustrating experiences too. It's just, um, yeah. So unfortunately, I think so relatable for a lot of women.
Mm.
Um, well, I'd love to just jump into the book itself and kind of dig in on a few different topics that you write about. In your introduction, you write, quote, "Medicine has inherited a gender problem. Medical myths about gender roles and behaviors, constructed as facts before medicine became an evidence-based science, have resonated perniciously. And these myths about female bodies and illnesses have enormous cultural sticking power. Today, gender myths are ingrained as biases that negatively impact the care, treatment, and diagnosis of all people who identify as women. So let's start out with some of these gender based myths. What
Mhm.
are these myths about gender roles and behaviors? Where did they come from? And how do they continue to show up today?
So in Unwell Women, I begin my history in ancient Greece, or specifically in classical Greece, which is for, the Western world, the kind of set the seat and the beginnings of learning and knowledge. And medicine, of course, was no exception. And during the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, there was a legendary physician by the name of Hippocrates, which many people would have heard of because his name is associated with the oath that medical practitioners used to take a form of, which is the sort of basic premise of ethical medicine. Now, Hippocrates was, we'd think, a physician who taught many other physicians. And those physicians produced, over the 4th and 5th centuries, a body of work that's known collectively today as the Hippocratic Corpus. And this was made up of different tracts authored by different physicians about illnesses, diseases, body parts, body types. And a great number of these tracts were dedicated to the health and diseases of women. Now, classical Greece, as this kind of center and seat of learning and knowledge, was also notoriously patriarchal. It was a society in which the social and biological difference between men and women was very ingrained. So when these doctors, these physicians, were writing about the body, about the female body, a lot of the way that they understood how the female body worked and how it needed to be treated when it was unwell, when it was dysfunctioning, was based on the social understanding. These physicians weren't performing autopsies on human people. They didn't have MRI machines. They were not able to
Mm-hmm.
look beneath the skin. So they were making certain assumptions based on what they could see and feel, but also based on what
Mm.
they knew to be true about the difference between men and women. And in a society where men are assumed to be dominant, superior, and authoritative, and women assumed to be secondary subjects, whose main purpose of existence is to bear children for men, to bear and raise the heirs of men. It makes sense to that society and to those physicians that the female body, the bodies that bear those children for men, would be understood as primarily reproductive. So the understanding of the female body that comes from ancient Greece, which is full of some really fantastical ideas like the wandering womb, whereby if a woman's uterus was not performing its social function as, gestating a child, it was believed that it would become kind of shriveled and dry and start creeping around the body in search of moisture. I mean, these are ideas that sound completely ridiculous, somewhere between a kind of fairy story and a horror film. It made sense. It really made sense for these physicians as a
Yeah.
way of kind of figuring out how on earth the female body could attain an equilibrium of health. This is a body that bleeds every month. This is a body that grows, bears a child, and kind of shrinks back again. A body that goes through the most incredible and to them inexplicable changes and transitions. But it's also the body of the person who's socially inferior, who exists for a particular male serving purpose. So when this discourse was created, it was kind of imbued with prejudices, ideas, assumptions, biases that women's bodies were naturally inferior, primarily reproductive, that all their health needs pivoted around this kind of reproductive system, this organ, this unruly womb. And that because women menstruated and became pregnant and gave birth, that these processes must be integral to their health equilibrium. So the Hippocratic Corpus is positing, this is a really authoritative document or set of documents. It's positing that what women are told they must do societally which is marry young, have marital sex, bear children, is also what they need to do for the good of their own health. And I
Mhm.
think this is the fundamental concept that I think has echoed through the centuries, that the female body is primarily reproductive above anything else. So her value, her worth, and also her needs as a human all center around the reproductive function.
You even share examples in this section that were so interesting to me that if something did go wrong, like
Mhm,
if a teenage girl, for example, was experiencing a health problem,
mhm.
that sometimes the diagnosis would be like she's getting too old, get her
Yeah,
married, get her having sex, put
yeah,
a baby in that girl, get her pregnant, and that would cure her, right?
absolutely. Because they sort of understood the female body as a kind of system. So too much menstruation without the break of being pregnant was seen
Mm,
as a kind of pathology. So there is this incredible the tale that you're referencing there is an incredible example from the Hippocratic corpus, which talks about the diseases of virgins or the diseases of young girls.
mm,
And it describes a sort of teenage girl, maybe of about 14, who is having what we might describe as a form of psychosis or a breakdown, a sort of hysterical episode where she's filled with melancholy and the desire to even end her life. And the diagnosis essentially is a sort of suffocation of menstrual blood, like having too much menstrual blood in one's body that sort of drives the emotion, like kind of too full of blood, and the emotions are driven bananas, and the womb as well, of course. So the cure was marital sex. Marry and have sex and procreate and give birth, because
mhm,
that is the process for which she exists, and that's what where this is where the sort of loss of stability and in emotional kind of her loss of her emotional state comes from. And
mhm.
it's always so fascinating to me and also terrifying that if this case was in fact based on real cases that the physicians at that time were seeing, imagine how fearful it would have been to be a young woman and to know that you would
Mm,
be married off at 13 or 14.
yeah. I mean,
It-
even that itself might be enough to make a girl
Exactly.
anxious and depressed and give her those symptoms in the first place, right?
Especially because, girls in this society, at least the sort of societally privileged girls who would be put into marriages in this way, they were marrying men that they barely knew, were often complete strangers chosen from them for them by their fathers, who
Mhm.
could have been at least 30.
Mm,
You're talking about marrying a man twice your age that you've never met. I mean, it happens, child marriage, and this is not something, sadly, that we have left in history.
yeah,
But to
true.
read this description of this kind of harrowing emotional experience in a young woman and to think that it was seen as a health pathology from lack of from, delaying her, basic kind of female function rather than a huge kind of emotional response to the sort of horrors of what lay before her is just such an incredible insight, I think, into exactly this insistence from male doctors on, well, what must be wrong with you is just going on. It's all going on in the womb. It can have nothing to
Yeah.
do with societal factors, nothing to do with anything other than this kind of monstrous organ that you're kind of
Mhm.
condemned to deal with.
Yes. Oh, um, hold on. There's something that, oh, yeah. You know what? Yes, and for listeners who don't know, actually, I remember being in Latin class in high school and learning that the root of the word hysteria comes from is it the word for uterus? And that's why it's
Yeah.
called a hysterectomy is,
Yeah,
when you have
exactly.
the
It's what
removal of the uterus.
hysteria is one of the ancient Greek words for uterus. So it was precisely from that word that in
Mhm.
the early modern period, the word for hysteria, and then from that hysterectomy was derived.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it's
Yes,
ingrained
it's very
in our language
telling.
as well.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, maybe we can move forward a little bit
Mhm.
historically, like chronologically,
Yeah.
and talk about the next step in the
Mhm.
chronology that reinforced patriarchal control over medicine.
So tracts like the Hippocratic Corpus, those were not the only ones that survived the sort of fall of the classical world, but they remained some of the ones that did survive and were translated and were transmitted across the centuries. And as we have works like the Hippocratic Corpus being translated into Latin and then later into the vernacular, they're of course translated not just in terms of what is there textually, but in terms of the new concerns as history has moved on about women and their bodies. And of course, the basic premise that women were primarily reproductive didn't dissipate as we moved out of the antiquity and into the Middle Ages. It was very much still there, but what we now had was the addition of another potent set of myths about men and women, which was Christianity and the Christian religion and the biblical myths that defined the creation, especially of man and woman, which we all know to be the famous myth of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Very specifically, I think one of the key myths that we have here, if we were to say the wandering womb myth really typifies medical attitudes towards women's bodies during the antiquity, I think the story that really shapes them during medieval Christianity is that of Eve being created from one of Adam's ribs, from a spare bit of a man. So
Yep.
Eve, the first woman, well, not quite the first woman, the second woman, is created from a spare bit of man's flesh. She's not made from the earth. She's not made in God's image. She exists to be an appendage to men. And because she wants to eat from the tree of knowledge, because she desires an independent intellectual existence, she and every other woman after her is punished by God with sorrow in childbearing and to be joined to men and be their helpmeets. And just as these sort of ideas about the wandering womb were assumed to be facts, so were these biblical stories assumed to be facts during medieval Christianity. And what we see in those sort of early centuries, say the kind of around the sort of 12th, 13th century, is that existing medical knowledge about bodies, about humours, about bleeding is then infused with these new myths. So there was a really sort of potent and extremely popular little book called The Secrets of Women, which was written around the 13th century. And it's easily the most it's so misogynistic that it's almost funny to read. Like, by today's eyes, it's so ridiculous and so hateful that
Yeah.
you can kind of read it as a parody. But unfortunately, it wasn't a parodic for the time, and it was a real example of how misogynistic churchmen, who were the people who kind of housed medical knowledge, how their attitudes towards women being these deviant, dysfunctional, devilish creatures affected the way that understanding of their bodies and health needs developed. And so in medieval Christianity, we see a lot of talking about wombs as sewers and menstruation as making women inherently deviant and women having this sort of irrepressible, insatiable appetite for sex that men just don't have. And
Mhm.
this is all from these kind of fundamental, all informed by the fundamental sort of gender stories that come through from the Bible myths, really, the Bible myths of Christianity.
Isn't that weird too? I remember when I learned that, just kind of as an aside, that there was a time when women were thought of being kind of the sex fiends and the ones with the
Mm,
crazy, like, libido who would
yeah,
be, the temptresses, right? They were devilish in
yeah.
their their influence on getting men to think impure thoughts and do impure things. I thought that was so interesting
It's
that it
really
used to be
interesting.
that, yeah,
It's
yeah.
especially interesting because the basis of that idea was that women had no they lacked the reason and ration and self-control
Mhm,
of men.
mhm,
And
mhm,
again and again and again in medieval Christianity, and we see these stories about how women have to women always enjoy sex, right? So enjoying sex is absolutely integral to getting pregnant. And this
right.
comes up again and again. And of course, it's something that in more recent years, this is a myth that's evoked against often against reproductive rights, often against abortion rights, which is that there is no women. If a woman has got pregnant, then she must have consented to a sexual encounter. So
Mhm,
this idea about this kind of voluminous, unwavering sexuality in women, it's something that's resonated, I think, really perniciously, not just medically but legally.
mhm. Yes, and I didn't realize that anyone had believed that in the last few hundred years until, like, there was a US senator in just
Yeah,
the last, I'm sure you heard about it, in the last couple of years that said
yeah,
something like that about rape victims.
yeah,
Like, it being impregnant, it meant that you consented and that you enjoyed it, and it was
exactly. Yeah,
unbelievable how these things are still, um,
when you
they're
see
still part of our consciousness.
completely. When you see a piece of writing from the 13th century talking about, William of Conches talking about how, you know, there's the reason that sex workers don't get pregnant often is because they take no enjoyment in their work.
Mm,
It has nothing to do with the fact that they may know how to limit their fertility, right?
yeah.
It's because
Oh
they
my
don't
goodness.
enjoy what they do. And
Wow.
from this ridiculous and completely, utterly prejudiced and sort of crazy notion, which also denies women any agency around their bodies, right? We have
Yeah.
something that, again, has this sticking power and really appeals to certain men in the present who would, orchestrate to remove rights and reproductive care from people.
Yeah. One other question I have about this period of time is that you mentioned before that uh, like people weren't dissecting bodies really for a long, long time, and so they didn't really understand even anatomy, right? They didn't understand the female body, not even the parts, let alone the function. But I'm wondering as we move forward, who was it who were actually practicing doctors? Were there any women doctors who were able to practice? And then what did they know and what didn't they know about the women's bodies? And I think we're focusing mainly on Europe in
Mm.
this medieval and moving into the Renaissance time period.
I mean, what's interesting is that women physicians do come up, and women physicians come to us through the historical record. And of course, during the antiquity and in the middle, in fact, for all of sort of human time, a lot of women's healthcare has been in the hands of other women. So, of
Mhm.
midwives, of women with healing knowledge, of their peers, relatives, and friends. A lot of what
Mm.
we're talking about with everyday medical care, the birth of babies, the caring for each other, caring for bodies, so much of that was done by women throughout history. But what comes to us and has survived down the centuries is sanctioned knowledge. And the problem isn't that women didn't practice medicine, it's that women were not allowed to study it and write about medicine. So even though a few figures do come to us through the archives, especially some really incredible midwife and birth caregivers, we know what we end up knowing, and what ends up being taken as canon are these sort of very authoritative texts authored by men who were part of this kind of genealogy, beginning with Hippocrates, coming up through the sort of monasteries and libraries of medieval Europe, moving into the schools of anatomy in Italy during the Renaissance. This is the legacy. It's one that represents the fact that it's men who've been allowed to write, men who've been allowed to study. And so when we look at the midwives' texts that come out from sort of earlier in the Roman imperial period, for example, there was this brilliant or very insightful text written by a gynecologist called Soranus, and he wrote a lot about midwives' practices. And from that, you can really see the expertise and the extent of the medical knowledge that midwives held. But it's not authored by midwives, it's authored by a man. But so we have to quite often read these sources to look for the invisible women, to look for the hidden women or the hidden sources of women's knowledge. And it's
Mhm.
from, and those women were not dissecting bodies either, but of course they have a certain amount of experiential knowledge that comes from
Yeah.
existing in their own bodies. From, and
Yes.
medical expertise is by no means essentialist. So I'm not saying that only, women who experience birth themselves could be midwives, but there was a certain empathy, a certain kind of bodily empathy, and also the ability to share between patients, to speak about one's body, which was always something that sort of interrupted the medical encounter throughout history. And that's the sort of propriety between men and women. The fact that women
Right.
were not supposed to talk about their bodies, they were not supposed to reveal their bodies. So it's always this kind of loss. You think about this sort of lost channel of history, sort of sitting underneath the major one that has survived and that we have followed as kind of medical canon, which is a women's
Mhm.
history, which is this sort of, and quite often that takes on, and I think sometimes not so usefully, a very mystical air. Like it
Mm.
becomes witchy or
Yeah.
sorcerousy rather than what it really was, I think, which is hard won expertise gleaned over generations of women through practice and study and learning and understanding the natural world and understanding one's body. And that probably brings us quite nicely onto witch trials, actually. I know we
Let's
didn't speak about them, but yeah, but in the end of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, we know that there was this horrifying epidemic of witch trials across Western Europe, where some 45,000 people were tried and executed as witches, and about 80% of those we think were women.
Mm.
And there's often a sort of myth associated with this that one of the motivations for the witch trials was the sort of need to stamp out women's medical knowledge, because it also coincided with a time when medicine was becoming much more professionalized. But I think honestly, this is sometimes overblown.
Hmm.
But it doesn't stop this period of time from being, an excruciatingly difficult period of our history, and also one that in some instances did target women who were medical practitioners, healers, and birth caregivers. There was, a rank misogyny that was informed by the things we've just been talking about around women's sexuality, around women's inherent deviancy, that also married with this fear of women's bodies and women's bodily knowledge.
Hmm. Can you talk about some of the kind of the big actors, the perpetrators that were kind of uh, maybe publishing about women and kind of started this movement to really vilify midwives and call them witches and then started these witch hunts. The one that I remember from the book is Heinrich Kramer. He was
Mhm.
particularly disturbing to me.
Yeah, so Kramer was a German monk who was also an inquisitor. So he was someone that the Catholic Church had sort of authority from the Pope in the Middle
Mhm.
Ages to prosecute and persecute people that he suspected of being enemies of the Catholic faith, of being heretics. And witches were a great obsession of Kramer's, or more specifically, women who may be practicing witchcraft were an obsession of Kramer's. And he wrote this absolutely horrifying book called the Maleficus Malicorium, or the Hammer of Witches, which explained in just exhausting detail how to identify, persecute, punish and torture mainly women for suspected acts of witchcraft. And Kramer was certain that witches existed, that they had sex with the devil in the form of an incubus, and that they then did his awful bidding on earth. And one of the professions that Kramer hated above all others and felt that witches were most kind of endemic in was midwifery. He believed that midwives, when they became witches, were capable of killing babies with a glance, of performing abortions with a mere touch, that they were stealing babies and dedicating them to the devil, that they were killing their own children. I mean, it's really horrific stuff. It's really
Mhm.
awful. But he was really convinced of this. But what's fascinating, again, is when we talk about these myths, is that the image of this crone-like midwife witch that Kramer was conjuring up in that book was almost sort of verbatim drawn from old Roman folklore and fairy tales about these
Mm.
sort of hideous female creatures who would devour infants in the womb. So that he was not reinventing the wheel here. He was merely kind of adding a new panicked spin onto old myths about midwives having these terrible intentions and getting up to awful things behind closed doors in birthing spaces. And I think the root of this anxiety, one of the major roots of this anxiety, is that midwives represented a sphere of
Mm.
women's activity that men were not privy to. You know, for
Mhm.
many centuries, men were not, it wasn't proper for men to be in birthing spaces. Births were really social events that often were accompanied by rituals, were accompanied by women talking to each other, with gift giving, with reading, with doing rituals with amulets and reading from parchment. And it's, you know, incredibly rich culture, but it's a women's culture. And the people in that room represented some of the most prized possessions of men, their wives and
Mm.
their partners. So I think it's really natural that men who were misogynist, men who hated women and feared their knowledge and feared their power, would denigrate that profession.
Mm. Yes, it does, it's just striking me anew as you're saying that I mean, I think probably since the dawn of time, people and I still feel that way. It's miraculous. It's almost it's almost too magical to really believe anytime that you witness the birth of your own baby or a baby that you love. Just it's the most powerful thing there is to witness new life, and that would happen in a space that men had no control over. Must have just really, really caused them a lot of anxiety. And like you said, if they have a proclivity toward misogyny, or they've been influenced by those Roman pamphlets or whatever, it's just going to make it go
Absolutely.
wild. And I also think one thing that I took away from this section too that really struck me is how brave those midwives would have been, particularly in an environment like that, where if they had a stillbirth, that they could be blamed and accused of witchcraft. It would really make you take seriously and have to think about whether you're willing to go into that
Mhm.
line of work, because it's dangerous for you, because that happened all the time. Mothers would die, babies would die, and you could be blamed for it. It's
Yeah.
it's absolutely appalling.
Yeah, that's something that is really shocking, is that in the
Yeah.
criteria, so there was this bull from the Pope that gave people like Kramer this kind of unhindered authority to prosecute people suspected of performing witchcraft. And within this
Mhm.
papal bull from, I think, the 15th century, is listed a list of kind of crimes, I guess, or things that witches were assumed to be capable of, which included, you know, causing male sterility, causing abortions, you know, impeding fertility. So the idea that there were these women who would sort of come along and were intent on disrupting the male control, the patriarchal reproductive order, was, you know, it was too much. It was far too threatening. And yeah, you do think, how could anyone want to undertake this work? Because for things so commonplace, the death of an infant, tragically common, a stillbirth, the death of a mother while giving birth, these are tragically common events, and any woman in proximity to them could be potentially accused of witchcraft. So yeah, it's an incredibly dangerous profession, and an incredibly courageous one too, to be
Mhm.
to be literally guardians of life.
Mhm. And how can you defend yourself, right? I mean, there's no way you can prove that you didn't. It's an absurd
Yeah,
accusation, and there's absolutely you have no defense, and then you're up against, like you said, the Catholic Church. You have the institutional might
yeah,
on one side, and if they
yeah.
choose to come at you, there's just nothing you can do. Incredibly
And
courageous,
especially
those
when
women.
you have these myths as well about women being inherently deviant and lying and
Yes.
capable of, falsehoods. So yeah, it was a monstrous, monstrous bit of history, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, thank you for writing about it and talking about it. I thought that was just a fascinating section of the book, as they all are. Okay, switching gears. One thing also that I was very interested in, I've had several people close to me suffer from endometriosis
Mm.
in my life. And you write that the way that the medical establishment has handled endometriosis is the way you phrase it is an object lesson in male dominated medicine's historic failures. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So endometriosis, as we understand it now, has been a chronic inflammatory disease that causes tissue that is similar but not the same as endometrial tissue to grow in other places in the body, has been something that you can spot through being documented through medicine's history since its very beginnings. But it wasn't named and sort of studied in a kind of conducive way until the 1920s, when a chap called Joe Vincent Meigs did studies on women who had some of the characteristic symptoms today that we associate with endometriosis, principally pain and excessively heavy menstrual bleeding. And he surmised that this was a disease that primarily affected privileged white women, because
Mm,
those were the women that he was studying,
mm,
and B, that it was caused by women prolonging or postponing marriage and childbearing in favor of, going to work and thinking and doing something other than other than procreating with their lives and bodies. He used the example that, monkeys don't wait to procreate, they just get on with it, and it's not natural. He's claimed that it wasn't natural to keep menstruating. He thought that women
ugh,
needed the cessation of pregnancy in order to be healthy.
mhm,
So, essentially, what Meigs was saying was that it was women's own fault for just not towing the domestic line and doing their principal social and biological duty. And I think that even though, and this I think is a really good example of what I said at the top of our recording about these fictions just resonate and they replicate, and instead of being challenged and debunked, new learning gets kind of layered upon old. And today we know that endometriosis for many, many decades has been thought of as a disease that only affects white women. It's been called a career women's disease in the mid 20th century. It was referred to as a career women's disease. And the hypothesis of continuous menstruation being the cause of endometriosis has also led to the myth that getting pregnant will cure it,
mhm.
which is absolutely not true. I mean, I know that some people who have endometriosis have experienced like a lessening of their symptoms if they were able to get pregnant. But we also know that endometriosis can make becoming pregnant really difficult.
Mhm.
So what we have now is a disease that affects a startling number of people with uteruses, but that is still incurable, frequently misunderstood, very often not, properly explained. And we know that it's one of the leading diseases that is where diagnosis is postponed for too
Mhm.
long because its symptoms, pain, heavy menstrual bleeding, etc., are among those symptoms that are so often associated with diseases that are apparently in women's heads rather than being
Mm.
in their bodies. And I think that this endometriosis is that object lesson. It's social stigma, prejudice about who gets ill and why, ideas about what women's bodies are for, and even with advances in medical science, these myths have stuck with us.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it strikes me even hearing you describe it now, it's like, just like, we've inherited it com
Yeah,
just almost unchanged from ancient Greece. Is the exact same language, it's the exact same diagnosis and prescription, and it just that's insane to me that so little has changed in literally thousands of years. And just also one big, theme in the book, and I know sadly from your own experience, I think too, Eleanor, is women not being believed when they say they're in terrible pain, and maybe just men being used to women's pain. I don't know if that's also inherited culturally from the biblical passage that says, in pain, you'll bring forth children. And so we all just have this expectation
yeah.
that women will be in pain all the time and we're okay with it, or maybe that they're making too big a deal of it. But this is a huge problem, right? That doctors don't take women's pain seriously.
Absolutely. And I think you're right that it is something we've inherited wholesale from as long ago as ancient Greece. It's something that have read constantly across the centuries, that the basic condition of the existence of a woman is pain, is one of pain.
Mm,
And
mhm,
that because we are primarily reproductive, because we menstruate, because that is our purpose, we have to bear that pain. It is we don't just exist to be in pain, we exist to bear that pain.
mhm,
And it's something that was articulated in ancient Greece when the female body was pathologized as a pain-feeling body, as a
mm,
body that is plagued by pain because of its reproductive state. It's something that also is then sort of further entrenched, as you say, from the biblical myth that women are kind of condemned through their own folly, their own deviance, to be in pain. And then it's something that it again is reiterated through the sort of emerging scientific study of a disease like endometriosis. So this idea that we are expected to bear pain has stained the understanding of women throughout medicine's history. And today we know that this bias is still so present. You know, when a woman's reports to an emergency room and says she is in pain, she's statistically less likely than a man to be given further diagnostic tests, to be offered painkiller medication, to be given offered opioid based pain relief. She's far more likely to be dismissed because it's just perceived as the condition of her being.
mhm. Well, this leads to the next topic that I wanted to talk about, because building upon that, women are assumed to, you know, have. Sorry, I'll start that sentence again. That wasn't very articulate. This leads to the next topic that I wanted to ask you about, Eleanor, because we now are going to add a layer on top of that misogynistic um, expectation that women will just bear pain. When we add uh, a racist
Mm.
layer to that, we've seen some just horrific, terrible medical practice regarding women of color, and you write about this extensively. I'm wondering if you could talk about racism in the medical field, and maybe specifically about a man named Dr. Sims
Yeah.
in the United States.
So Dr. James Marion Sims was an American doctor in the early mid 19th century who, for a long time, was regarded as the father of American gynecology. So he's a pioneering gynecologist. And he had a practice in Montgomery in Alabama, where I think two-thirds of the population were enslaved people. And he would treat enslaved people working on the plantations in Montgomery. And oftentimes the enslaved people who needed medical attention were women who'd been forced to bear children for slave owners, been forced to bear children with other slaves for the purpose of increasing the yields of slaves. I mean, it's just horrifying. But sometimes Sims would purchase female slaves from their owners and use them as clinical specimens upon which to experiment and practice his gynecological surgeries. He perfected, in his words, a surgical procedure for a vesicovaginal fistula by experimenting on young enslaved women. I think there are about 11 young enslaved women. And there's a posthumous biography of Sims where he talks about some of these procedures that is one of the most harrowing things I have ever read. Not just for the content, but for the fact that Sims is utterly disregarding of the humanity of these people. And that he's also, vaingloriously convinced by the just nature of his mission. He's convinced that he's made a surgical procedure that can cure an otherwise incurable condition in white women by abusing the bodies of enslaved women who had no choice about what happened to them. Some of the justification for what Sims did, there is no justification for what he did, but the way he justified it to himself was through these beliefs at the time, which sort of came through kind of colonist and anthropological colonialism, that not people who were not white felt and experienced pain differently. That there was a sliding civility scale of pain of white people because they were apparently refined and delicate, and they experienced the most amount of pain. And then there's a sliding scale, and black people experience the least amount of pain. We know now that these ideas, which are kind of collectively called scientific racism, were put forward as apologies for the abuses of chattel slavery. So if you create a system of knowledge which says that certain kinds of people are less than human, then it justifies the treatment of them as less than human. And scientific racism, although now, of course, thoroughly debunked, we see its resonances today in the fact that Black women are far more likely to die of pregnancy and maternal health related causes than white women are. We know that where a white woman might be accused of being, say, hysterical or overly anxious in a doctor's office, that a Black woman has to fight that much harder to have her pain recognized at all. And in terms of the biases, we know that it's really important not just to talk about gender, but to talk about all the intersections. And, the double indignity of misogyny and racism that Black women continue to suffer today. And it's something that reaches into sort of every aspect of a person's life experience, right? Because it's not just, conditions that tend to be more overlooked in Black women, such as endometriosis and certain kinds of heart disease, but also things like postpartum depression, is something that is not as frequently diagnosed in Black women because there is this assumption that they're not kind of allowed to have the emotions that white women might have after giving birth. And the absolutely tragic and harrowing shadow behind that is that throughout the centuries of chattel slavery, enslaved women were not treated as mothers, as human people, but as reproductive kind of specimen, reproductive raw material. And that section about Sims was the most difficult to write in the book. And there used to be a statue of Sims that stood at the top end of Central Park, and campaigners had for years wanted that statue to be taken down, and it finally was a few years ago. And I think that much more knowledge has been arising and awareness has been arising now that we have to think about who enabled these, advances in medical science to happen. Because for every advance in medical science, there is a human body. There's a real person suffering beneath it.
Yeah.
And what's been really incredible to see is that Lucy, Betsy, Anarcha, and the enslaved women who Sims experimented on their stories are being told, and they are being hailed as the mothers of gynecology. And I think that is how we do history. That is how we look again. We
Mm.
look again at who created this knowledge, and we tell those stories.
Yes.
And that is a real
Yes.
way to rescue these women to our history, not just to focus on their pain and their victimhood. Of course, they were victims, but also on the fact that they are the makers of history, and that in the present we can honor them and go some way to giving them the humanity and dignity that they were not allowed in life.
Yes, I have to tell you, I was in Montgomery, Alabama, just a
Mhm.
few years ago, and we were seeing all of the civil rights history sites. And we got off the bus. I was with a group at Stanford, um, and I didn't know where we were going next. And we got off the bus and walked up, and there were these giant, completely arresting statues made of all kinds of metal from like scrap metal from all different things. And they were so beautiful. And I just gasped. I had read your book maybe a year and a half prior, and I knew immediately who they were. They were these beautiful sculptures of these Black women. I don't know if you've seen them in person or have seen pictures of
Seen
them.
pictures of them. I would love to see them in person. I've just seen pictures, but yeah, they're absolutely extraordinary.
They are, and I again, I didn't even know that that's what we were going to see. My head was in another spot. I was thinking about other things in the civil rights movement. We walked up, and I gasped and got chills from head to toe, and I thought, that's Lucy and Anarcha and Betsy. I knew it, and the artist was there and took us around. So it was just beautiful, and I highly recommend. We'll have on the website, we'll have pictures of these sculptures. But to your point, there's a big movement, and I know she was working to have especially those three women's names known more, and especially kind of to establish some other landmarks in Montgomery as well, to bring that gynecological history to light. So it was really amazing. But I was so happy that I knew about them because of your book. So thank you so much for writing about it and bringing that important topic to light. And I can only imagine how difficult it would have been to read those primary sources and have to do that. But I'm so glad you did. Well, one last thing that I want to ask you about, Elinor, is that I understand you have a new book coming out in 2026, and it's about motherhood. So I cannot wait to read it. Honestly, you could write about anything, and I would read it. But I'm just thrilled to hear it's about motherhood. If I'm allowed a sneak peek, I'd love to know a little bit about your next project.
Yeah, so thank you so much for asking me about it. It's been, a long time coming. I think that with one's first book, it's often something you've been sort of living with, and it's been germinating for years and years. And the second book is after that can be quite an undertaking, but it's been again a complete privilege to write about the huge topic of motherhood. It's a book that really focuses on maternal bodies, maternal mothering lives, and also mothers' rights. Again, following quite a similar historical trajectory. This one begins in the 9th century BCE and goes up to the present.
Wow.
So, some of the, what really fascinated me when writing Unwell Women was that this idea that, women are primarily reproductive. So I almost wanted to flip the story around and go, okay, well, but what has that meant? But what has that actually meant for women's lives? And it's been fantastic because this time round, the men are, really shelved, and I focused as much as I can on the writings, lives, activism of women and people who mothered. So yeah, I'm I'm really excited for it to come out. Got a little while yet, but yeah, it will be out in the spring of 2026.
Oh, I can't wait. I'll definitely pre-order that, and maybe if you're able, would love to have you back on to talk about it once it comes out.
That would be a
That would be
total
great.
pleasure. I would love to.
I guess we're getting to the end of the conversation, which is just, uh, I'm so sad about it. This has been so delightful to talk with you. But maybe we'll end with a couple of takeaways, maybe one from me and one from you.
Mhm.
One of the passages that I have carried with me is where you write, "Speaking out about your own body is profoundly feminist. It is a generous and sorry, it is generous and courageous to revisit and recall the trauma of pain, and a radical gesture in a culture skewed towards doubting and disbelieving women. It's a risk, but at the same time, it's an act of defiance against those power structures in the man made world that would prefer us not to speak." Um, I was really moved earlier in our conversation when you talked about, I think it was in the context of the Middle Ages and how, because of just codes of modesty and propriety, women wouldn't have felt comfortable sharing things about their bodies with male doctors. And doctors were only men were allowed to be doctors. And
Mhm.
so there's just this gap in knowledge because women couldn't share what they were actually experiencing with male doctors. And I think that has persisted on to today. And I can even say that I feel that a little bit, just like there's still this
Mhm.
shamefulness in women's bodies, women's symptoms, especially our reproductive health. It's really hard to speak out about our bodies because of shame, and perhaps especially if there's religious shame,
Yeah.
but also
Mhm.
just not being believed, like you
Mm.
said. And so it is a risk and it does require courage. And I have remembered that sentence word for word: speaking about your own body is profoundly feminist. And so that's kind of my takeaway that I would love to leave with listeners. Do you have any thoughts about that, or then some of your own thoughts that you'd like to leave with people?
I think that I still stand by it. Speaking out about one's body is profoundly feminist. It's something that people involved with the women's liberation movement in from the 60s and 70s, they were working really hard to create systems of knowledge and care by demystifying this kind of medical understanding that had always been claimed and held by men, that had been annexed away by, the white-coated gods, the authoritative men, and creating these, and they were resisting this, or breaking this down, dismantling this power structure by creating caregiving networks, self-health networks, and but most of all, by speaking out and creating communities and groups in which they could speak for the first time about what it was really like to exist in a female body in a patriarchal world. And I always seem to come back to this kind of moment in history as the moment when, not the moment when women began to speak, but the moment when women coming together to speak about their bodies and creating spaces for each other to do that became a form of political resistance. And I feel just so honored to be the generation that I'm in who has benefited from that incredible bravery of women, of all kinds of different women, of all races, sexualities, gender identities coming together to create a culture in which we can find the courage to speak out about what it means to exist in our bodies. Because all throughout history, silencing and shame has been forced upon us. We've been forced to kind of wear and carry with us this burden of male shame, and it isn't our shame and it isn't our burden. So I always feel just incredibly grateful to be part of this generation that's benefited from that bravery, and also to imagine what might be possible in the future. I already see, from social media, something that I didn't grow up with, that I had as an adult, um, networks, resource sharing, information sharing, spaces where the identity of being a woman in pain isn't a diminishing one, where it becomes a different way to connect, it becomes a different way to see the world. And I just think that is incredible. So I would always say, if you have the courage and you want to speak out, you will then enable someone else to find courage. If you can't, then there are people there who will hold space for you and hold your stories.
Oh, that's incredibly inspiring. Thank you for that. Well, I love you ending with that, Elinor. That was incredibly inspiring and uplifting. And as listeners know, we're ending each episode with action items, and so I just love that can be what listeners take away is really being brave and courageous and speaking about your own lived experience, especially in the medical field, where actually we do need women to speak up about their actual experience. We need more women to go into the medical field, right, and to close the gaps of knowledge that persist in medicine. So speaking out is a feminist act, and I'm so grateful to you for writing that, because that is something that I've carried with me. So thank you, Elinor. And maybe the last thing I'll ask is just where we can find your work. Do you have a website or social media handles that you can share?
I am at Elinor Cleghorn on Instagram, and I'm also on Blue Sky under the same handle. So yeah, do get in touch.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Elinor Cleghorn, thank you once again for being here today. I just learned so much from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.